For those who seek adventure, this is the Buffalo Roamer Podcast, sharing the people, places, and moments that make a life on the loose worth living.
The thing that's going to stick out to you most is when they open up that plane door. The cold is something like you've never felt.
The jungle's so thick, even if you had a machete, you couldn't get through it.
There's a huge blonde grizzly bear. And when it saw us, this thing put its head down, stomped on the ground, and hissed like an alligator.
I just crossed this brutal stretch of desert, and I was really suffering.
I'm your host, Will Collins. I'm an adventurer, outdoorsman, and roamer of wild places. I've backpacked the Brooks Range, rafted the Grand Canyon, and have canoed from source to sea, both the Mississippi and Yukon rivers. I live for adventure, travel, fresh air, and diving into the unknown. And now, I hope to share my passion with you on the Buffalo Roamer Podcast. All right, episode 26 of the Buffalo Roamer Podcast, officially live. Here we go. It's going to be a fun one. Got Peter Marshall on the show today. Also got all kinds of awesome guests lined up for you and set to come out in the near future. So keep it locked here for more stories of adventure. Couple things before we get to today's show. One, if you have not subscribed to the Buffalo Roamer Podcast, you got to do that. Please subscribe. Two, tell a friend about the Buffalo Roamer Podcast. Trying to get this show to grow, and the best way to do that is grassroots word of mouth. If you have an adventure buddy, maybe you're in the car shuttling somebody at the river or heading to the chairlift to the mountain to ski or whatever it is, pop on the Buffalo Roamer Podcast. Or if you have a friend who you know listens to podcast and is an adventure buddy, shoot him a text with a link to the Buffalo Roamer Podcast. That go a long way. Also, please give us 5 stars in the Apple Podcast app. That goes a huge way as well. And then reach out. Give me a shout. You can email me or DM me on Instagram or message me on Facebook. Let me know what you think of the show. Let me know if you're enjoying it. Let me know if there's somebody on the podcast that you'd like me to get or somebody that you'd like to hear or someone you'd like me to talk to, or just let me know what's up. Say, just reach out and say, hey, I always appreciate that. Have had a few people do that recently who have randomly found the show and reached out, and always appreciate that. Buffalo Roamer at yahoo.com or on Instagram and Facebook at Buffalo Roamer. Okay, the show today, Peter Marshall is my guest. Peter Marshall is an adventurer, a paddler, a canoeist, and a man of the North. In 2005, he did a canoe trip from Minnesota to the Arctic Ocean. 2012, he did a 2,600-mile trip from the Pacific Ocean of Alaska to Hudson Bay. 2014, he did a Labrador Passage expedition in all 1900s garb, canvas tents, the whole deal. He's currently the communication director at Friends of the Boundary Waters. So we get into all that and more on this episode of the Buffalo Roamer Podcast with Peter Marshall. There's so much I want to pick your brain about. We were just talking before we started about the Outdoor Expo in Minneapolis, which is kind of a gathering of adventurers, I guess, and boats and people who love getting outside and doing crazy stuff that Midwest Mountaineering puts on in Minneapolis every year. And you kind of had a hand in putting together presentations with them for a while.
Yeah, back in the day. Well, not too long ago, I guess. I was there for about 5 years, and it was kind of a side job, which was awesome because everyone who works there is great, and then I got to meet a lot of cool presenters. But I basically set the schedule for the April and November expos, lined up the presenters, took care of the BAM Film Festival that comes through there every year. Hope to go back, next spring, because it's, obviously had to change dramatically this year.
Right.
But yeah, that's definitely a treasure that we got in Minneapolis. Cool little local gear shop. It's been there 50 years now. So if you're in there, I don't mind giving Midwest Mountaineering a plug.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great shop.
Even though they didn't pay for it, they're not a sponsor, but they deserve a plug.
That's all right. I'm all about it. So on top of all that stuff too, just some of the list of some of your expeditions and some of your trips have been badass and awesome. Give me like a bullet point or like a quick breakdown of some of your different trips and expeditions.
Sure. So the highlights reel, I guess, starts when I was 16. and went on my first canoe trip through an organization called Les Voyageurs out of St. Cloud, Minnesota, and went up to the Atakaki Provincial Park and Woodland Caribou Provincial Park in central Manitoba and Ontario. Then 1999, the year after that, when I was 17, went up to Nunavut, above the 60th parallel, and paddled the Kazan River with Les Voyageurs again. And then I was off on my own, right? So I did 2 big trips through this organization. I was hooked on paddling. I had these books. I had all these books on paddling, all these routes printed out. And I was ready to, ideally paddle a new river each year. Didn't quite work out that way, but I still got plenty of good trips in. So my first trip that I did on my own was the Missinaibi River in Ontario, and that was with your former guest, Winchell.
There you go.
And we started at, that was the first trip we did together. We started at Lake Superior and went overland to reach the Missinaibi River, and then went down the Missinaibi to James Bay. So that bisected Ontario. And
hey
then
Peter,
in 2000,
real quick, I think your mic is either rubbing on your shirt or something.
yeah, there it goes.
Sweet, perfect.
Okay,
Ready to rock.
You want me to repeat that?
No, you're good. You can just keep on going where you were, and yeah, you don't have to, just be cognizant of it.
Sure. Okay. And then 2005, that was my brother and I. We started at Lake of the Woods, right on the Canadian border, northern Minnesota, and we paddled 2,600 miles across central Canada up into the Arctic Ocean, ending on the Coppermine River.
Crazy.
That was 122 days. Yeah, that was that trip kind of came about because, like I said, I wanted to do a river every summer, but it was hard to find people to do trips with and whatnot. So me and my brother were chatting, and we're just like, well, let's just do, 5 trips in one summer and link it all together, make up for the ones we haven't done. Yeah. And then after that, did the Moisey River in Quebec, which is just a phenomenal river. Tons of whitewater, waterfalls. You're in, 800,000 foot deep canyons. Just unbelievable. And then 2009, did the Back River, which is in Northwest Territories in Nunavut, ended on the Arctic Ocean. That was about, I think, 45 days. And then 2012 was by far the most challenging trip I did. That was the Territorial expedition from Skagway, Alaska to Chesterfield Inlet, crossed all 3 territories in Canada from the Pacific Ocean to the Hudson Bay. So that was 130 days.
Gnarly.
And then my last big expedition was 2014, when I went out to Labrador and the eastern provinces and attempted to retrace a route that was done in 1905 by a woman named Mina Hubbard and 5 guides who are all indigenous that she had with her. We tried doing this trip, which is obscenely difficult, by the way. Easily would have been the most difficult trip I did, but we tried doing it with gear that they would have used in 1905. So like 105-pound cedar strip canoe, wax canvas rain gear, a 30-pound canvas tent. We had to turn back from that. No one lost a limb. We were slightly embarrassed, but we didn't have to get rescued or anything. But we did have to turn back. And that was my last big one. So that was over 5 years ago. And then since then, I'm married. I have a 3.5-year-old right now. So I usually get away once or twice during the summer to do a trip in the Boundary Waters, or last year I went to the Quetico, and still definitely though have, the hit list of trips and rivers I want to do. So
I know what you mean. Well, that's epic, man. That is quite the, that's quite the list on a paddler's bucket list right there. awesome. A lot of those, I consider myself pretty tuned in to the canoeing and paddling world, and it seems like a lot of those are hidden gems that I don't know about, and that's what makes them cool too, right?
Yeah. There's definitely a few on there that not many people go to, but then others, like in 2012 we went on the South Nahanni River, which is kind of on everyone's to-do list, and I'll say for very good reasons. Sometimes the band is popular because that band's really good, and like Pearl Jam. So that's the South Nahanni.
No doubt
There's a reason
about
everyone
it.
wants to do it.
Yeah, I actually just discovered that river not too long ago, and high on my list to get up there and bag that one at some point.
Yeah, for sure.
So I want to dive into all of this stuff, but just out of curiosity, let's dive into the latest one, the Labrador trip. Also, I've heard Labrador pop up a bunch in my world recently. What is the draw to Labrador? And give me like a breakdown of the backdrop of the history that you wanted to retrace in your trip, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, where do I start? Labrador definitely has this strong lure, that whole northeastern part of Canada. When I was kind of coming of age as a paddler, the focus was on central and western Canada, just because it's kind of where Minnesota is, relatively where Minnesota is. So, and I didn't know a lot of people who paddled out there. But I started meeting people from out east, like in Vermont and Maine, and that's kind of their northern playground if they go up there. And it's really this incredible it's not untouched. There's obviously plenty of forestry and dam work, but this incredible tract of wilderness, and there's maybe 30,000 people who live there, and it's kind of has everything I look for in that everything that I find so appealing about the northern landscape, where it's rocky, it's cold, trees are barely clutching to the rocks and stuff, in some areas, of course. So it's really kind of captured my imagination, and probably the strongest way it did that was through this this story of Leonidas Hubbard and his wife Mina Hubbard and their two expeditions into Labrador at the early part of the 20th century. So the story here is that Leonidas Hubbard, he was one of these naive would-be adventurer types who
aren't we all?
Wanted to make a name. Exactly, right? Like I identify with him way too well, right? But he wanted to make a name for himself, and he found this area in Labrador where the cartographers and the European explorers really hadn't been, and it was still unmapped. And 1900s, most of North America had been mapped by this point, with some exceptions in the far north. And then there's also reports that there was a tribe of indigenous people, the Naskapi, that lived there, who were still living much the same way that they would have lived before the Europeans arrived. And obviously this is, incredibly rare in 1900s. So he thought, I'm going to go map this area, make contact with these tribes, and I'm going to become famous. Which sounds great. And he convinced his friend Dylan Wallace to go with him. And Dylan was like a 40-year-old attorney who had no business in the wilderness. And then they recruited, through recommendations of people, half Scots, half Cree man named George Elson, to kind of serve as their guide. So they went up into Labrador, and, like I said, there weren't maps of this area. Trappers had been back there, but they didn't make maps or anything. And they set off, and without knowing it, they pretty much went up. They went up the wrong river than they were supposed to. And the river they went up is really steep, and it's probably a little more of a stream than a river. But they were really dogged and stubborn and kept pushing west. But eventually, they came to the conclusion that they did not go on. They made a wrong turn, right?
They messed up.
They messed up. It was October, snow's already falling, and there's no way they're going to make it to their end goal, which was on the Ungava Bay. So they turned back. They tried to retreat. They turned back, trying to retreat back to where they came from, where there was a Hudson Bay post on the Northwest River. And Leonidas became increasingly weak, and ultimately George and Dylan had to make the decision to leave him behind while they went to try to find help back at this Northwest River post. And there was a lot of indigenous people and trappers who lived in the area, so they were hoping that they could get help from them. Dylan had to be left behind, and George, barely made it to help. He's walking in these in rags. It's snowing up to his knees. You read the accounts of this, and you're just amazed that he made it as far as he could. But a family did find him. A family of trappers found him, took care of him, and were able to go and retrieve Dylan. And so those two survived. However, Leonidas starved to death probably 1 or 2 days after they left him. So, this would have been just another story of naive would-be adventurer who starves to death on his dream trip. But then what makes it really interesting and really intriguing is that afterwards, George goes back to his small town in Canada, and Dylan goes back to New York City, and he tells Mina Hubbard, who's the widow of Leonidas, this is what happened. And of course, she's an aggrieved widow at this point. And Dylan writes a book about their journey. And when the book comes out, it's an immediate bestseller. People gobble this kind of stuff up. But where Mina was expecting it to be, my husband was brave, and no man could have survived this. Fate dealt him a bad hand. Dylan was pretty forthright in saying there are a few mistakes that Leonidas made, and if he didn't make these mistakes, maybe we would have survived.
Right.
So this just pisses her off. And something interesting in the whole, the history of dumb dudes who starve in the wilderness, they tend to have really, really fiery widows.
Sure.
Like Lady Jane Franklin, after the Franklin expedition disappeared, she was a staunch defender of her husband. And same with Scott's widow, after he died trying to go to the South Pole, she just had a campaign to basically dismiss Amundsen, who made it to the South Pole first, his achievements. Right. So Mina is pissed off, and what she does, instead of just, waging some press war, is like, well, I'm going to go do this trip. And so this is 1905 when she eventually goes on the trip. Needless to say, women weren't a common sight in the wilderness in 1905, which makes it pretty spectacular in itself that she would do this. And she actually contacts George, who was with her husband, to accompany her on this trip. And he recruits 3 other men who are all indigenous as well. So they have a crew of 5 this time, 4 men, 1 woman. But then at the same time, Dylan decides that he wants to go back because, he's a celebrity now and he has unfinished business. And he puts together a crew of 6, and it turns into basically this race between Mina's crew and Dylan's crew. And they definitely hated each other, which you can get from the accounts of it. Go ahead.
Yeah. And so how does it all shake out? And then how does it tie into your your expedition in 2012, retracing these steps in as much as you could, or at least maybe you could tell me how much garb of the time, for lack of better words.
Sure. Yeah. So, long story short, they both make it to the end point. And Mina's trip is complete opposite of the first expedition, to get on the correct river to begin with, which is still really hard to get up. But, according to her journal and the men's account, like, it was a great trip. They loved it. It was a great kind of 50 days out. And Dylan made it as well, but he was, 4 of his men had to turn back, and he was 6 weeks behind them. So, she definitely beat him, there, but no one starved to death this time. So this story really has become pretty popular, with a, small group of people, because there's so many interesting dynamics there. So I had learned about it, and, the area they travel through is a place I always wanted to go in Labrador. And then this is after my 2012 trip. And I think at this point in my life, I always felt a little bit like, yeah, I did a cool trip, but I also had, a 1 pound raincoat and these amazing bomb-proof tents, and, really thrived because I had this great modern technology. How would I do with old-timey gear? Which is a good question. I probably should have picked a different trip, though, to try this out on.
And why do you say that?
Because, well, so this old-time gear is, needless to say, way heavier than anything we have, right? And it's not quite as waterproof. So the tent, like I said, the tent's 30 pounds. It's canvas. The rain gear is probably 5 pounds altogether. You got a stove. Hauling a stove. Got a wool blanket. Got a triple portage, everything. And so we're going up the Nescapi River, it's called. So the trip begins. You go across this 40-mile lake, easy paddle. Then you get to the Nescapi River, and it's kind of gentle to start off with. And then, Labrador is a steep mountainous area. So it's a wild ride. It's a lot of just dragging boats up rapids. And we got to this point in, where we call it the Wapistan Portage, because the Wapistan River flows into the Nescapi. And this is where Mina's crew pretty much bypassed this canyon, and they did it by essentially portaging 14 miles through the woods. Yeah, that's a long time. That's a long time if you've got a 4-wheel track, guiding you through. So this is where we turn back, and we turn back and we turn back because, it was just too much, basically, right? So we were about 3 miles into the portage, like 2.5 days. I twisted my ankle, had like this little micro fracture on my foot, had a lot more in front of us. And the portaging was atrociously difficult. Labrador, right, it gets that North Atlantic current. So in June and July, when we were there, you look at the averages, it's almost about the same amount of rain that Seattle gets in the winter. Right. So it's a lot of rain, which means it's a thick forest, and there's no trail there. No one's out there. A few trappers go out there in the winter, maybe. Right. And then so it's, the trees are really close together, thick forest, and then the floor is about a foot of reindeer moss that you're stomping through, which means you're also tripping on roots all the time.
And how long?
It's brutal.
How long had you been out there at this point when you come to the foots of this 14-mile portage?
Yeah, it was only about 2 weeks. Okay. Right. So, and part of it wasn't like we pushed ourselves to the absolute limit and we had to go back. It was pretty much a pretty rational calculation that, we've done 3 out of 14 miles. There's a lot more ahead of us. In the best scenario, we would get to the headwaters of the Nescapi by day 40. At which point we'd have 10 days to go across Lake Michikamau, which is about 80 to 90 miles of paddling, and then do like 350 miles down the George River. and that's best case, right?
Right.
That's assuming no injuries. And injuries just, I mean, like I said, I already had these minor stress injuries, and, you know, I was kind of limping around for a couple of weeks afterwards, and it was only going to get worse. And this was kind of the point where we turn around now. I mean, we can still turn around. If we do make it to the end of this portage and we keep pushing, like the only way out is to, you know, hit the spot device and have a airplane fish us out, which would be awful.
Yeah.
I mean, it's better than starving to death, but you know.
And so how did you find in these 2 weeks? Obviously, you've done all kinds of other expeditions and long tripping and short tripping and all kinds of stuff. How did you find that the 30-pound canvas tent and all the old style equipment held up outside of the weight?
You know, it's you get used to it really quick. You know, I've always believed that, you know, humans are more adaptable than we think. And we have so many comforts and conveniences in our modern life that a lot of times you think if those get taken away, you kind of get into this panic. Well, how will I do it? Right. But in this case, I got used to being not so dry when it rained.
Yeah.
And the canvas tent it's fully waterproof, even though it is a complete mind fuck, you know.
Setting up.
You can bleep that out, but when it's raining and you're in canvas, you're just like, how is this keeping me dry?
Am I dry?
Like, right. And like, don't touch the sides, all those things. So, I mean, we got used to it. It's just, and we did fine in it. But it's just, if you're going to be portaging as much as we were, don't bring an outfit that requires you to triple portage and weighs, you know, like 80 to 90 pounds a pack.
Funny. Okay. So now going all the way back to the first big solo, or not solo, but the first big trip of yours from Minnesota to the Arctic Ocean. How did that come about, and that just sounds wild, going up through Canada. When did the current switch from going up? Would you go up the Minnesota River and then catch the Red River of the North?
No, we started at Lake Winnipeg,
okay.
And then went across Lake Winnipeg to the Winnipeg River into Lake Winnipeg.
And I
said Winnipeg there a lot.
What was your general takeaway from that trip, being your first real big gnarly expedition?
Yeah, that's a good question. I gotta think back to it. You know, like I said, that expedition, like a lot of these trips come together just because you look at a map and there's just so much water in Canada, and then you start getting creative and you're like, well, what if I put this here and then went here and then, you know, connected A to C, where there'd be a route. And that's essentially what we did. And, you know, a lot of this route has been done. I mean, there's been other people who have done kind of a similar trans-Canadian canoe trip this way, just because it's kind of an obvious route. But I think, you know, for me personally, you know, it was one of these times I was just out of college, no idea what I wanted to do, but I, you know, sure as shit didn't want to get a corporate job or start a 401k. And I think it was a great opportunity while you're young to still do something big, which I was always aware of. I knew it would become less and less possible to do trips like this as I got older.
Sure.
So wanted to take advantage of that. And then I was lucky enough that my brother kind of had the same mentality and didn't place too much of a value of starting a career when you're 23 or 25 as we were. So,
sure. Okay. So again, I'm kind of jumping all over the place here,
sure,
through all your different trips, but obviously at times you spend a lot of time, more than most, in the far north. Any wildlife encounters that stick out to you from these 3 different trips, or all your time up there, close encounters, or any one in particular that comes to mind?
Yeah, I've definitely seen a lot of wildlife, especially when you're in the tundra and there's no trees. Had plenty of bears come into camp. Nothing noteworthy there. I think saw a couple grizzlies. I've never had a polar bear encounter, which I'm very glad for.
Yeah, knock on wood, right?
Yeah, scary. The closest call I had was on that 2005 trip with my brother, and we had just paddled onto Lake Winnipeg, this huge body of water. The wind kind of picked up, and we found this nice rocky shelf where we could set up camp. And I remember we were just my brother had set up the tent, and we were just we made some coffee, I think, and we were by the canoe, and it's like this rocky beach we're on, and then we hear this rustling in the woods, and I hear something in a tree, and I look up, and there's two cubs in the tree. And, I remember my first thought was like, oh, cool, cubs. And like instantly I was like, oh, shit.
Right. Where's mama?
Oh, boy. Yeah, because that's the worst situation. I've seen cubs and mama bears from a canoe. And like the look those mama bears give you is like, I'm going to kill you. But you're in a canoe, you're going downriver.
Yeah.
No big deal. But this time it was like, we got to get the tent down, and then we have to run to the canoe, which is between us and the cubs. Luckily, we were fully prepared to jump into the lake if mama appeared and figure out what's next, but luckily we didn't see the mom. We saw the cubs, and we just ran to the canoe, threw all of our stuff, threw all of our bags in the canoe haphazardly, and paddled around to where the tent was, and took that down quick and put it into the canoe, and didn't see the mama. But that always stands out as kind of the closest, could have just been a disaster in my mind, just like that. But every other time with wildlife, I think I've been pretty lucky. Seen a couple grizzly bears, had muskox come through camp before, but yeah, that's just awesome. That's just that's just great. I've been pretty lucky as far as dangerous encounters go.
How about, is there one story or a general thing, if you like sit down at a bar with somebody and you have maybe you wouldn't say it yourself, but if I was sitting down, we both sit down at a bar and introduce somebody new, and I'm like, yeah, here's my buddy Peter over here. He's done all these crazy canoe trips. And they're like, what? Like, is there one story that you tell or that like comes to mind from all of these different ones? Or comes to the forefront?
That's a good story. Not a good story. That's a good question. I think probably my favorite day on trail was when we reached the Continental Divide in 2012. So a little background, we had spent the last, at least it was 500, probably about 50 days, at least 50 days, going up the Pelly River and the Ross River in the Yukon Territory.
Okay, and just to set the scene, right? This is going from the Pacific Ocean in northern Alaska to Hudson Bay, right?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, so this is the 2012 trip, 2,600 miles from Alaska to Hudson Bay. Obviously, the big challenge with that is you got to get across the Rocky Mountains, or the northern extent of the Rocky Mountains. And to do that, we had to go up two major rivers, the Ross and the Pelly rivers, which are wide, twisty rivers that just had a steady current in them with occasional rapids. It was also, right after ice breakup when we started the trip with ice on the lake on the headwaters of the Yukon. So we're in spring flood stage while we're going up these rivers, and it was something like a 40-year high for them in the Yukon. There are areas that got flooded out. So we had high water levels, which just makes it more difficult. Our pace was pretty grueling, 12, 14 hours to make 8 to 10 miles a day. I did pretty well with it. Winchell did pretty well with it. We're both kind of like, all right, we want to kind of get our butts kicked.
Right.
Our buddy Steve, who was on the trip, who's, easily like the guy you want to have on any expedition because he has medical training. He's like expert whitewater, just a great companion on trail. He's funny. He just hated it. There was one point where he like snapped. He's just like, "This is the dumbest thing anyone has ever done."
Going upriver?
Do you know how stupid you are for doing this, Peter? It was pretty funny. But we were going up the Ross River up towards the trying to reach the headwaters of the Ross, and 2 to 3 miles on the other side of the headwaters of the Ross River are the headwaters of the South Nahanni River. So the river gets, smaller and smaller and smaller. And then we find what is definitely something of a portage trail. The thing that distinguished it was someone left a German candy bar wrapper, and we're like, oh yeah, because no one's up here, right? No one goes to the headwaters of the Ross River. One or two people to get to the Nahanni, they get flown in there. But then we're like, okay, this is definitely the portage. So then we portage through this kind of maze of willows for 2 miles, and we got to Moose Ponds, which is the headwaters of the Nahanni River, and this was the part of the expedition that was definitely had the most unknown about it. Like, could we get up the Pelly or the Ross?
Right.
To the point that we didn't know anyone who had done it. We hesitated to ask people because they're just like, why? No. Locals were just like, yeah, good luck. So we got there, and it was just, oof. Oh, that's a good feeling.
Yeah.
Poured a little whiskey, had taco mac and cheese for dinner, and it was just, you're just like on cloud 9. It was such a great feeling to know that we just went upriver for 500 miles. We crossed the Continental Divide, and we were about to go downriver and go down, and not just any river, but the South Nahanni River, right? That, thousands of people want to go out down, and it's one of the definite natural wonders of northern Canada.
No doubt. Yeah, that's awesome, man. It kind of reminds me of one moment where I kind of had a similar feeling. I think I was backpacking in the Brooks Range of Alaska, and this was probably like this was an early trip in my tripping career with Camp Manitouish, who I was going through. I was 17 at the time, and I remember hiking. We were hiking up a pass, and then we were it was really, really steep chute, basically all kinds of scree, and it was just grueling. It was like one of the first one of the first weeks or so that we were out on the trip, on this 45-day trip, getting our asses kicked up this pass. And then I remember like standing at the top of the pass and looking over the valley that we were going to be descending into, and just thinking like, oh, this is amazing. Like, not only am I already at the peak, but that was the first time in my life that I remember like looking over the winding river valley that this little creek made in the middle of backcountry of Alaska, and just being like, man, I am a long way from home, and this is freaking awesome. That was just one of those moments that sticks with me still. Like, oh, this is epic. Like, I am in the middle of nowhere right now.
Yeah. You always got to have those experiences always seem like they wouldn't you wouldn't have them if you didn't go through some ordeal, to get them.
Totally.
It's definitely part of the whole package.
Absolutely.
Like if you just flew into the top of that mountain and be like, yeah, it's a nice river down there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And speaking of that, curious what some of your bigger challenges or challenging days or moments have been on some of your trips. Like, is there something that comes out when you're like, oh, dude, that was fucking brutal. We were bushwhacking, portaging through willows or for 2 days or whatever. Like, what were some of those difficult moments that you look back on?
Yeah, I think, like I described, the portaging in Labrador was definitely physically some of the most difficult travel that I've experienced easily. But a lot of it just has to do with your mental state and where you are in life. Like I look back, my first trip I did in central Manitoba when I was 16, that first half, like I was a scrawny kid. I didn't do sports. Like, what the hell was I doing on this canoe trip? I just got my ass kicked for the first 2 weeks. And if I were to go back now, it wouldn't be easy because there's definitely like a lot of portaging, but I'd enjoy myself and get a good workout. But I wouldn't come back saying like, wow, that was one of the hardest things I did. But, at that point in my life, that was easily, mentally and physically probably the biggest challenge for me. And I just didn't, it was this initiation into northern travel. Whereas now, like I'm so familiar and I feel so at home, on a rainy, buggy day hauling a pack that I don't even necessarily, I'll end the portage sweating and be like, "Whoo, glad that's done." But I don't really think like, "Oh, that's a real challenging thing." Sure. If that makes sense.
No, totally.
And my mentality too has been, almost since that first trip, I kind of got instilled in me what we were just talking about, that hard days on trail, like you're rewarded for those in kind. Like I think that really makes for the experience. And I'm not necessarily, in my day-to-day life, like more pain, more gain, or, right. Challenge yourself and, do 100 push-ups every hour or something. But when I'm on trail, I do like to push myself. And I think part of it is it makes that warm, dry sleeping bag just all the better.
Absolutely.
I don't know if I answered your question, but
no, that's okay. It does. And it reminds me of the time that clicked for me as well. I was paddling in northern Saskatchewan. I was on a 30-day trip up there. Again in my youth. I think I was 16 at this point, and I had, it was raining sideways. It was cold. It was windy. We were on like a stillwater lake, waves crashing, and I just remember in my mind like, man, this kind of sucks. And then I remember like, okay, well, what am I going to do about it? We're out here in the middle of nowhere. It's raining. It's cold. And all of a sudden, like my mind just shifted, like might as well enjoy it. And I remember the leader of the trip had said, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. And I remember that mantra just like clicked in my mind, and I was like, oh shit, like this is easy. Like it's windy, it's rainy, but it's awesome. I'm in, like this beautiful spot. Like I can't wait for some warm chili mac, like you said, warm sleeping bag, right, or whatever it is. And it's just that I specifically remember that moment when that shift happened, where it was like, all right, this sucks, but it's time to, brood up and get her done.
Yeah, it's kind of similar on my first trip. It rained almost every day for the first 2 weeks. And I remember one time at lunch, we were all eating lunch on this rocky outcrop, and bugs are out, and we're all 16 and just whining, of course, about how awful this is. And the guy, the leader, it stuck with me. He just said, guys, when else are you going to be able to eat lunch with mosquitoes in the rain? It's like, good point. Good point.
Oh, that's good. You've mentioned the Nahanni. You've mentioned a little bit of Labrador, but how about any sections from your trips that draw you as just like awe-struckingly beautiful? Like if you could go back and repaddle one section or go to one spot, what would it be and why?
Yeah, my answer to this is always the east arm of Great Slave Lake.
Okay.
It's spectacular. So Great Slave Lake is kind of divided into two, if you will. It's on not a fault, but the western half is all in this low-lying boreal forest, and the eastern half is all on the Precambrian shield. So you got the east arm of the Great Slave Lake, and it's rocky granite, thin forest cover, literally thousands of islands that you can just hop around on and explore, big cliffs. It's really spectacular. I think it's very similar to the Boundary Waters in northeastern Minnesota, but, kind of amplified in that sense. And then, on the far eastern part is Pike's Portage, which we were on in 2012, which connects Great Slave Lake to the Barren Lands. And that is a series of like 8 or 9 portages between little lakes. And it's just a fantastic few days I spent portaging there, like, wide open trails over eskers. And some of the lakes you came to are just these, just magnificent specimens of boreal lakes. But yeah,
Awesome.
East Arm of Great Slave Lake. Love that area.
Awesome. Yeah, I flew into Great Slave Lake, or I flew into Yellowknife one time, and just remember looking at the lake from the air, being like, okay, that thing's freaking big.
Yeah. It's a large one.
Yeah. You mentioned the Boundary Waters, and you're currently working with Friends of the Boundary Waters, right?
Yep. I'm the communications director for them.
Okay, awesome. So tell me a little bit. I've actually never been to the Boundary Waters. Obviously, I know a little bit about it, but give me a breakdown of the Boundary Waters and kind of what's going on with the Boundary Waters right now.
Sure. So the Boundary Waters is federally protected wilderness area in northeastern Minnesota. It's about 1.1 million acres, over 1,200 lakes, and it's prime canoe country. Thousands of different routes you can take between these lakes, portage trails connecting all of them. It's a little slice of Canada in the U.S. of A.
Take what we can get, right?
Exactly. So it is, and it's the most popular wilderness area. And I should explain, a wilderness area, is designated as a federally protected area, and it has the most protection of any federal land. So there's no motors are allowed in it, no permanent structures. So you don't have motor boats going past you.
That stat always blows my mind. I've never really come to grips with it or comprehended it, that it has the most visitors of any wilderness area. Is that the stat?
Yeah, and I think wilderness area, that's a specific term. So,
Sure.
Obviously like Yosemite or Yellowstone, it has way more visitors than the Boundary Waters.
Right.
But that's a national park. But yeah, wilderness area, like with capital.
Okay, awesome.
W. Yeah.
And
yeah, I know it can get kind of confusing. I think when I first heard that, I'm like, no way. But then you're like, well, wilderness area.
Yeah,
right.
and it's obviously it's a super popular area. I've been wanting to go and do a trip up there for some time, and obviously there's I guess I don't know the right term for it, but there's controversy surrounding the Boundary Waters, and has been for some time, with mining interests in there as well. So what's the story with that, and where do we stand currently?
Yeah. So, I always tell people this because I think I'm right about it, from what I know, but the Boundary Waters is probably the most continuously controversial piece of land in the United States. Since 1902, when the first kind of plot of the area was set aside and kind of kept from the timber industry, up until today, there's always been controversy over the use of the Boundary Waters, because it has this double tension, right? That it's both rich in natural resources, right? It's right next to the Iron Range. Obviously, the French fur traders came and depleted the area of fur-bearing animals. There were huge stands of white pine. So it's rich in natural resources. And then, as anyone will tell you who's been there, it's also incredibly rich in natural beauty. So there's this tension between, can we just use it for economic purposes or set it aside for recreation and try to maintain it as a preserved wilderness area? So this controversy has been going on for well over 100 years. But currently, the main issue of contention are proposed copper sulfide mines right next to the boundary waters. And they've known about copper deposits in the area since the late 1940s. But the copper is really low grade ore. So it's really expensive to get out of the ground. And it's never really been profitable until recently because of certain market activities and newer technology. The danger with copper sulfide mine is that the copper is bound up in sulfide bearing ore. I hope I got that right.
That's all right.
But basically, sulfide bearing ore, when it's exposed to oxygen or water, it has a natural chemical reaction that produces sulfuric acid. So just like if you expose iron to water or air, it produces rust. This ore produces sulfuric acid, which is the same thing as battery acid, chemically speaking. And that leaches into the groundwater, or seeps into the groundwater, then into the surface water. And as a effect, it can acidify lakes, which has huge impact on wildlife and fish. And then it also leaches out heavy metals that are naturally occurring in some of those rocks. So it leaches out mercury, lead, all these nasty things. And there hasn't been, a copper sulfide mine that hasn't polluted nearby water sources. So if you put that next to the boundary waters in an area that's as water rich as northeastern Minnesota, you just have a recipe for disaster, because it wouldn't just pollute, nearby water sources around the mine. That water spreads, that water moves. It would go into the boundary waters and carry through, hydrologists estimate maybe 2 million acres of water. So really these mines pose an existential threat to the clean water of the boundary waters. We know we know that these mines will pollute. There's more than enough ample evidence to show that. And what they'll pollute is really a national treasure, the boundary waters. So we are, fully committed to fighting both twin metals and polymet. Twin metals is about 2 miles outside of the boundary waters within the same watershed. Polymet is about 12 miles outside of the boundary waters. It's actually in the Lake Superior watershed. But opening one mine will lead to future mines, we maintain. So that is definitely the bulk of our work at Friends of the Boundary Waters is fighting these mines.
And where is this process stand at the moment as we speak here in November 2020?
Oh boy! So here's I always say this about mining is that it's pretty easy to understand on the surface, right? That you're digging up a bunch of rocks, you're crushing them, produces sulfuric acid, could pollute. People get that. I get that. But then the battle gets pretty complicated pretty fast. And it's tied up in legal actions primarily. So my job, of course, as communications director is to make it understandable and not put people to sleep, because really it has to do with contract law, which single guys out there is not a topic to bring up at a bar if you see a attractive lady. It's not the most exciting topic. But it's really important. So right now, the main battle with twin metals, which is at the edge of the boundary waters, has to do with 2 mineral leases that had expired under Obama administration. The Forest Service did not agree to renew them, citing irreparable harm that such a mine would have to the boundary waters, and didn't think it would be a good idea to have these mines here. However, after Obama left office, Trump came in to the White House, and one of the priorities of this administration was to renew those leases, which they did through some pretty tortured legal reasoning. They pretty much took, expired leases and gave them new life in a way that we say is arbitrary and capricious and frankly not legal. So we challenged that in court. And we lost our first case on this, and we will be appealing that to the I hope our lawyers aren't listening. They'll be upset, but I think it's the DC District Court will be appealing.
Right.
One step down from the Supreme Court. So we could go all the way to the Supreme Court with this one.
Okay.
But it has to do primarily with, it's a classic case of government buddying up with industry to give industry what they want, despite what people want, despite what science says is good for the area. And despite, frankly, what the law says is permissible. And that's the situation we're in now.
Awesome. I appreciate the breakdown, because you always hear, whether it's Save Bristol Bay, Save the Boundary Waters, you hear the slogan and kind of understand a general gist, but aren't always able to get at least a surface level in depth about some of the stuff. And not to steer this conversation too far off the rails or dive too far into this topic, but just out of curiosity, are there other areas, or I don't know the process of copper mining at all or what it does. And obviously we all, just to play devil's advocate, right? We all use copper. There's copper in my cell phone, which I'm using to talk to you now. These are all resources that we do use. What's the stance or status for the boundary waters, and those of us that want to protect the boundary waters, but still also use all of these resources? Like, what is the middle line there from your perspective, or from Friends of the Boundary Waters?
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a good question, because it is true. Our lives depend on copper, and we can't, try to go a day without using anything with copper. It's pretty tough.
Right.
The response is that while the world does need copper, and we all use copper, they don't need these mines. The two proposed mines right now, Polymet and Twin Metals, if they ever went fully operational, I forget the exact number, but they would produce under 0.5% of the total world production of copper.
Sure.
So that's not, even statistically significant amount. Sure. What's more important is recycling, and more robust recycling programs. And again, you got to be careful about how you recycle your copper and your electronics, to make sure, I forget the exact certification. It's dad brain, bad memory. The kid doesn't sleep well, to make sure that you're recycling with a place that doesn't just ship it overseas, but does it in house, and that actually provides jobs for people, and is a way to increase the copper that we put back into our daily use. Copper is probably the most recyclable material as well. One of the most recyclable metals, that it can be used over and over and over again. So I guess overall, better recycling programs, I think, is where we need to focus our energy on. And again, we all use copper, but these mines are not necessary for the future of a digital or green economy. They just wouldn't provide that amount of copper that would make or break a system like that. And
at the expense of one of the crown jewels of the natural world, right? It's not like this is just going in the in the bowels of whatever state you choose, right? Right.
Yeah, this is in a very watery part of the United States. And we're also in an era where clean water is becoming increasingly rare and increasingly valuable. So you can live without copper. It's hard, but you can't live without clean water.
I like it. All right. Where can people find out more about what's going on in the Boundary Waters, and does your organization need help, or can they use help, or where do you point people towards who are looking to learn more or to chip in?
Yeah, I point them towards our website, friends-bwca.org, or just Google Friends of the Boundary Waters. We have a lot of information about both of the mines, information about our educational program, our programs to get underserved youth up into the Boundary Waters as well. And yeah, we are a small nonprofit. We do rely primarily on donations from individual donors. So I just say, don't take the Boundary Waters for granted. Like I said, it's definitely one of the most controversial pieces of land in the United States. And there's many different ways history could have gone differently, and we wouldn't have it. And the future isn't necessarily guaranteed. So we always have to be vigilant and watch out for it. So if you enjoy going up there, chip in $30 a month. $30 a year makes you a member, and the wilderness greatly appreciates it.
Awesome, man. I love it, and I appreciate you putting in the time and fight for the Boundary Waters as well. So yeah, well, Peter, I think with that, dude, I'll wrap it up. Appreciate the time. Thanks so much for the stories, and hopefully maybe once this whole coronavirus thing blows over, we'll be able to run into each other at a Midwest Mountaineering Expo.
Yeah, let me know if you're in town. That'd be sweet.
All right, episode 26 of the Buffalo Roamer podcast in the books. Thanks so much for tuning in. Always appreciate it. Got tons of more stories of adventure and awesome guests lined up, so keep it locked to the Buffalo Roamer podcast. Please subscribe. Tell a friend about the Buffalo Roamer podcast, and give us a 5-star review in the Apple Podcast app as we try and grow this train and get this thing chugging along to more people. Also, reach out to me, buffaloroamer@yahoo.com, or on social media @Buffalo Roamer. Give me a shout, say what's up, let me know if you're enjoying the show, if it sucks, or if there's some guests or something you want to see. Give me a shout. Always like talking and connecting with people. All right, until next week, take it easy on the Buffalo Roamer podcast.